Chapter 2 Financial Background. The beginning of monetary control. Napoleon said, "When a government is dependent for money upon the bankers, they and not the leaders of the government control the situation. Since the hand that gives is above the hand that takes, financiers are without patriotism and without decency." Karl Marx said in the Communist Manifesto, "Money plays the largest part in determining the course of history." The Rothschild found out early that when you control the money, you basically control everything else. So, while their political plans were being thwarted, they began to concentrate on tightening their grip on the financial structure of the world. In the mid-1700s, the colonies were prospering because they were issuing their own money, called colonial scrip, which was strictly regulated, and didn't require the payment of any interest. When the bankers in Great Britain heard this, the British Parliament passed a law prohibiting the currency, forcing them to accept the debt money issued by them. Contrary to what history teaches, the American Revolution was not ignited by a tax on tea. According to Benjamin Franklin, it was because the conditions were so reversed that the era of prosperity ended. He said, "The colonies would gladly have borne the little tax on tea and other matters had it not been the poverty caused by the bad influence of the English bankers on the Parliament, which has caused in the colonies hatred of England and the Revolutionary War." In 1787, our new Constitution gave Congress the power to coin money, and regulate the value thereof, Article 1, Section 8. After Great Britain tried to destroy and control the currency of our new country, Congress realized the danger of fiat, or paper money created by law. In 1775, paper money had been issued to finance the war, and independent state legislatures passed laws requiring citizens to accept it as legal tender. Since it was created from nothing, and not backed by any precious metal, inflation developed. By the end of the war, it took 500 paper dollars to get one silver dollar. Our forefathers wrote in Article I, Section 10, of the U.S. Constitution, "No state shall enter into any treaty, alliance or confederation, grant letters of marque and reprisal, coin money, emit bills of credit, make anything by gold and silver coin a tender in payment of debts, pass any bill of attainder, ex post facto law, or law impairing the obligation of contracts, or grant any title of nobility." Alexander Hamilton, an illuminist, an agent of European bankers, had immigrated to the colonies in 1772 from the British colony of Nevis, on the Leeward Islands in the British West Indies. He married the daughter of General Philip Schuyler, one of the most influential families of New York. In 1789 he was appointed Secretary of the Treasury. Hamilton and Robert Morris successfully convinced the new Congress not to take this power literally, enabling the Bank of North America to be established in 1781, which was similar to the Bank of England. At the time, America had a foreign debt of $12,000, in money borrowed from Spain, France, Holland, and private interests in Germany, and a domestic debt of $42,000. In 1790, Hamilton, who favored central banking, urged the Congress to charter a privately owned company to have the sole responsibility of issuing currency, in order to handle the country's financial situation. His plan called for Congress to create a central banking system, with a main office in Philadelphia, and smaller branches located in important cities throughout the country. It would be used to deposit government funds and tax collections, and to issue bank notes to increase the money supply needed to finance the country's growth. This Bank of the United States would have a capital stock plan of $10 million, with 4/5s to be owned by private investors, and 1/5 by the U.S. government. It would be administered by a president, and 25 board of directors, with 20 to be elected by the stockholders, and 5 appointed by the government. Central banking was initiated by international banker William Patterson in 1691, when he obtained the charter for the Bank of England, which put the control of England's money in a privately owned company which had the right to issue notes payable on demand against the security of bank loans to the Crown. One of their first transactions was to loan £1.2 million at 8% interest to William of Orange to help the king pay the cost of his war with Louis XIV of France. Patterson said, "The bank hath benefit of interest on all monies which it creates out of nothing." Reginald McKenna, British Chancellor of the Exchequer, or Treasury, said 230 years later, "The banks can and do create money, and they who control the credit of the nation direct the policy of governments and hold in the hollow of their hands the destiny of the people." Hamilton's elitist views and real purpose for wanting central banking came to light, when he wrote, "All communities divide themselves into the few and the many. The first are rich and well-born, the other the mass of the people. The people are turbulent and changing, they seldom judge or determine right." In 1791, Jefferson said, "To preserve our independence, we must not let our rulers load us with perpetual debt. If we run into such debts, we will then be taxed in our meat and our drink, in our necessities and in our comforts, in our labor and in our amusements. If we can prevent the government from wasting the labor of the people under the pretense of caring for them, they will be happy." Even though Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, later to be our fourth president, 1809-17 opposed the bill, Washington signed it into law on February 25, 1791. Alexander Hamilton became a very rich man. He and Aaron Burr helped establish the Manhattan Company in New York City, which developed into a very prosperous banking institution. It would later be controlled by the Warburg-Kuhn-Loeb interests, and in 1955 it merged with Rockefeller's Chase Bank to create the Chase Manhattan Bank. When Jefferson, 1801-09 became president, he opposed the bank as being unconstitutional, and when the 20-year charter came up for renewal in 1811, it was denied. Nathan Rothschild, head of the family bank in England, had recognized America's potential, and made loans to a few states, and in fact became the official European banker for the U.S. government. Because he supported the Bank of the United States, he threatened, either the application for renewal of the charter is granted, or the United States will find itself in a most disastrous war. He then ordered British troops to teach these impudent Americans a lesson. Bring them back to colonial status. This brought on the War of 1812, our second war with England, which facilitated the rechartering of the Bank of the United States. The war raised our national debt from $45 million to $127 million. Jefferson wrote to James Monroe, who later served as our fifth president, 1817-25 in January, 1815, the dominion which the banking institutions have obtained over the minds of our citizens, must be broken, or it will break us. In 1816, Jefferson wrote to John Tyler, who became our 10th president, 1841-45, if the American people ever allow private banks to control the issuance of their currency, first by inflation, and then by deflation, the banks and the corporations that will grow up around them will deprive the people of all property until their children wake up homeless on the continent their fathers conquered. I believe that banking institutions are more dangerous to our liberties than standing armies. The issuing power should be taken from the banks and restored to the government, to whom it properly belongs. On May 10, 1816, President James Madison signed the bill, which created the Second Bank of the United States. Inflation, heavy debt, and the unavailability of an entity to collect taxes were some of the reasons given for its rechartering. The new charter allowed it to operate another 20 years, raised its capital stock to $35 million, authorized the creation of bank branches, and the issuing of notes with denominations no smaller than $5. The new bank now had the power to control the entire fiscal structure of the country. The bank was run by the Illuminati, through such international banker frontmen as John Jacob Astor, Stephen Girard, and David Parrish, a Rothschild agent for the Vienna branch of the family. In 1819, the bank was declared constitutional by Supreme Court Justice John Marshall, a Mason, who said that Congress had the implied power to create the bank. People began to see how much power the bank really had, and the voter backlash led to the election of Andrew Jackson as president in 1828. His slogan was, "Let the people rule." Jackson maintained, if Congress has the right under the Constitution to issue paper money, it was given them to be used by themselves, not to be delegated to individuals or to corporations. Jackson said that the control of a central bank would be exercised by a few over the political conduct of the many by first acquiring that control over the labor and earnings of the great body of people. During the 1828 presidential campaign, Jackson said in an address before a group of bankers, "You are a den of vipers. I intend to rout you out, and by the eternal God I will rout you out." He went on to say, if the people only understood the rank injustice of our money and banking system, there would be a revolution before morning. Jackson said that if such a bank would continue to control our currency, receiving our public monies, and holding thousands of our citizens in dependence, it would be more formidable and dangerous than the naval and military power of the enemy. After fiscal mismanagement by its first president, former Secretary of the Navy, Captain William Jones, the bank was forced to call in loans and foreclosed on mortgages, which caused bankruptcy, a price collapse, unemployment and a depression. However, the bank began to flourish under its new president, financier Nicholas Biddle, 1786 to 1844, who petitioned the Congress for a renewal of the bank's charter in 1832, 4 years before its current charter expired. The bill for the new charter passed the Senate, 28 to 20, and the House 107 to 85, and everyone knew how Jackson felt. Biddle threatened, "Should Jackson veto it, I shall veto him." Jackson did veto the charter, and abolished the bank in 1832. He ordered the Secretary of the Treasury to remove all government deposits from U.S. banks and deposit them in state banks. On January 8, 1835, Jackson paid off the final installment on our national debt, and it was the only time in history that our national debt was reduced to zero, and we were able to accumulate a surplus, $35 million of which was distributed to the states. Nicholas P. Trist, the president's personal secretary, said, "This is the crowning glory of A. Jay's life and the most important service he has ever rendered his country. The Boston Post compared it to Christ throwing the money changers out of the temple. James K. Polk, the Speaker of the House, who later became the 11th President in 1845, said, "The Bank of the United States has set itself up as a great irresponsible rival power of the government." The bank continued to operate until 1836, and it was used by Biddle to wreak havoc upon the economy by reducing loans and increasing the quantity of money. Jackson became the first President of the United States to be censured, which was done in March, 1834, for removing the government's deposits from the Bank of the United States without the express authorization of the United States Congress. It is quite obvious that he did it because of the abuses and corruptions of the bank, and the censure was later reversed by the Senate in 1837. The bankers continued their attempts to revive the bank. President John Tyler vetoed two bills in 1841 that would have rechartered the Bank of the United States. In 1837, the Rothschilds sent another one of their agents to America. His name was August Belmont, real name, August Schoenberg, a cousin of the Seligman family of Frankfurt, Germany. In 1829, as a 15-year-old, he started working for the bank in Frankfurt, and proved himself to be a financial genius. In 1832, he was promoted to the bank at Naples, so he could be fully integrated into international banking. He became fluent in English, French, and Italian. His mission was to stir up financial trouble within the southern banks. He ran a bank in New York City, and established himself as a leading figure in financial circles by buying government bonds, and later became a financial advisor to the president. In 1857, the Illuminati met in London to decide America's fate. They had to create an incident which would allow the establishment of a central bank, and that had to be a war, since wars are expensive, and governments have to borrow to pay for them. Canada and Mexico weren't strong enough, as evidenced by Santa Anna's defeat in Texas the year before. England and France were too far away, and Russia wasn't under their control, so they decided to divide and conquer, by fomenting a conflict between the North and the South. The North was to become a British colony, annexed to Canada, and controlled by Lionel Rothschild, while the South was to be given to Napoleon III of France, and controlled by James Rothschild. In order to begin a movement that would lead to the secession of the South from the Union, the Illuminati used the Knights of the Golden Circle, which had been formed in 1854 by George W. L. Bickley, to spread racial tension from state to state, using slavery as an issue. Wartime members included Jefferson Davis, John Wilkes Booth and Jesse James, 1847 to 1882, a Mason, who after stealing gold from banks and mining companies, buried nearly $7 billion of it all over the western states in hopes of funding a second civil war. The Ku Klux Klan, formed in 1867, were the military arm of the Knights. The states which seceded, united into the Confederate States of America, which meant they maintained their independence, and that if the South would win, each state would be like an independent country. Abraham Lincoln informed the people that combinations too powerful to be suppressed by the ordinary machinery of peacetime government had assumed control of various southern states. He had coastal ports blockaded to keep supplies from being shipped in from Europe. The Rothschild financed the North through emissaries August Belmont, J. Cook, who was commissioned to sell bond issues, arranging with Belmont to sell Union bonds in Europe, J. and W. Seligman and Company, and Speyer and Company. Judah P. Benjamin, 1811-84 of the law firm of Slidell, Benjamin, and Conrad, in Louisiana, was a Rothschild agent, who became Secretary of State for the Confederacy in 1862. His law partner, John Slidell, August Belmont's wife's uncle, was the Confederate envoy to France. Slidell's daughter was married to Baron Frederick Derlanger, in Frankfurt, who were related to the Rothschild, and acted on their behalf. Slidell was the representative of the South who borrowed money from the Derlangers to finance the Confederacy. Towards the end of 1861, England sent 8,000 troops to Canada, and in 1862, English, French and Spanish troops landed at Vera Cruz, Mexico, supposedly to collect on debts owed them by Mexico. In April, 1861, the Russian ambassador to America had advised his government, England will take advantage of the first opportunity to recognize the seceded states and that France will follow her. On June 10, 1863, French General Élie Frédéric Faure, with the help of 30,000 additional French troops, took over Mexico City, and controlled most of the country. Through his representatives in Paris and London, Tsar Alexander II in Russia discovered that the Confederates had offered the states of Louisiana and Texas to Napoleon III, if he would send his troops against the North. Russia had already indicated their support for Lincoln, but wanted something more to send their large navy to defend the country. On January 1, 1863, as a gesture of goodwill, Lincoln issued his Emancipation Proclamation to free the slaves, just as the Tsar had done with the serfs in 1861. On September 8, 1863, at the request of President Lincoln and Secretary of State William H. Seward, Alexander sent the Russian fleet to San Francisco and New York, and ordered them to be ready to fight any power and to take their orders only from Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln said, "The privilege of creating and issuing money is not only the supreme prerogative of government, but is the government's greatest creative opportunity. By the adoption of these principles, the taxpayers will be saved immense sums of interest." On February and March 1862, and March 1863, Lincoln received congressional approval to borrow $450 million from the people by selling them bonds, or greenbacks, to pay for the Civil War. They were not redeemable until 1865, when 3 could be exchanged for 1 in silver. They were made full legal tender in 1879. Thus, Lincoln solved America's monetary crisis without the help of the international bankers. The London Times later said of Lincoln's greenbacks, "If that mischievous financial policy which had its origin in the North America Republic during the late war in that country, should become indurated down to a fixture, then that government will furnish its own money without cost. It will pay off its debts and be without debt. It will become prosperous beyond precedent in the history of the civilized governments of the world. The brains and wealth of all countries will go to North America. That government must be destroyed or it will destroy every monarchy on the globe." Bismarck, the German chancellor, said in 1876 about Lincoln, "He obtained from Congress the right to borrow from the people by selling to it the bonds of states, and the government and the nation escaped the plots of the foreign financiers. They understood at once that the United States would escape their grip. The death of Lincoln was resolved upon." Before the Lincoln administration, private commercial banks were able to issue paper money called state bank notes, but that ended with the National Banking Act of 1863, which prohibited the states from creating money. A forerunner of the Federal Reserve Act, it began the movement to abolish redeemable currency. A system of private banks was to receive charters from the federal government which would give them the authorization to issue national bank notes. This gave banks the power to control the finances and credit of the country, and provided centralized banking, under federal control, in times of war. The financial panic created by the international bankers destroyed 172 state banks, 177 private banks, 47 savings institutions, 13 loan and trust companies, and 16 mortgage companies. Salmon P. Chase, Secretary of the Treasury, 1861-64 under Lincoln, publicly said that his role in promoting the passage of the National Banking Act was the greatest financial mistake of my life. It has built up a monopoly which affects every interest in the country. It should be repealed, but before that can be accomplished, the people will be arrayed on one side and the bankers on the other, in a contest such as we have never seen before in this country." Lincoln said, "The money power preys upon the nation in times of peace and conspires against it in times of adversity. It is more despotic than monarchy, more insolent than autocracy, more selfish than bureaucracy. I see in the near future a crisis approaching that unnerves me and causes me to tremble for the safety of my country. Corporations have been enthroned, an era of corruption in high places will follow, and the money power of the country will endeavor to prolong its reign by working upon the prejudices of the people until the wealth is aggregated in the hands of a few and the republic is destroyed. I feel at the moment more anxiety for the safety of my country than ever before, even in the midst of war." On April 14, 1865, Lincoln was shot by John Wilkes Booth, and that same evening, an unsuccessful attempt by his fellow conspirators was made on the life of Seward. In 1866, an attempt was made to assassinate Tsar Alexander II, and in 1881, the Tsar was killed by an exploding bomb. In Booth's trunk, coded messages were found, and the key to that code was found among the possessions of Judah Benjamin. Benjamin had fled to England, where he died. It was always known that Lincoln's death was the result of a massive conspiracy. However, nobody realized how deep and far-reaching it was. In 1974, researchers found among the papers of Edwin M. Stanton, Lincoln's Secretary of War, letters describing the conspiracy cover-up that were written to Stanton, or intercepted by him. They also found the 18 pages that were removed from Booth's diary, which revealed the names of 70 people, some in code, who were directly or indirectly involved in Booth's original plan to kidnap Lincoln. Besides Stanton's involvement in the conspiracy, Charles A. Dana, Assistant Secretary of War, and member of the Illuminati, and Major Thomas Eckert, Chief of the War Department's Telegraph Office, were also involved. Journals and coded papers by Colonel Lafayette C. Baker, Chief of the National Detective Police, detailed Lincoln's kidnap and assassination conspiracy, and subsequent cover-up. The plot included a group of Maryland farmers, a group of Confederates including Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederacy, and Judah Benjamin, the Confederate Secretary of War and Secretary of State, a group of Northern banking and industrial interests, including J. Cook, Philadelphia financier, Henry Cook, Washington, D.C., banker, Thurlow Weed, New York newspaper publisher, and a group of radical Republicans who didn't want the South reunited with the North as states. but wanted to control them as military territories, and included Senator Benjamin Wade of Ohio, Senator Zachariah Chandler of Michigan, and Senator John Conness of California. All of these groups pooled their efforts, and used actor John Wilkes Booth, a Confederate patriot. The original plan called for the kidnapping of Lincoln, Vice President Andrew Johnson, and Secretary of State Seward. The National Detective Police discovered their plans, and informed Stanton. Planned for January 18, 1865, the kidnap attempt failed. Captain James William Boyd, a secret agent for the Confederacy, and a prisoner of war in the old Capitol Prison, was used by the National Detective Police to report on the activities of the prisoners, and to inform on crooked guards. He looked similar to Booth, and ironically, had the same initials. Stanton had him released, and Boyd took over the northern end of the conspiracy, which had been joined by the police and the War Department. The North wanted to kill Lincoln, while Booth wanted to kidnap him and use him as leverage to get Confederate prisoners of war released. Booth failed twice in March, and then ended up shooting Lincoln at Ford's Theater. Boyd, warned that he could get implicated, planned to flee to Maryland. He was blamed for attacking Seward, which he didn't. Boyd was the one who was shot at Garrett's farm, and identified as Booth. The police and Stanton discovered that it was really Boyd, after it was announced to the nation that it was Booth. The only picture taken of Boyd's dead body was found in Stanton's collection. The body was taken by Colonel Lafayette Baker, to the old Arsenal Penitentiary, where it was buried in an unknown place, under the concrete floor. Baker and detectives Luther and Andrew Potter knew the case wasn't closed, and had to find Booth to keep him from talking. They followed his trail to New York, and later to Canada, England, and India. He allegedly faked his death and returned to the United States, where in Enid, Oklahoma, he revealed his true identity on his deathbed. The mortician, who was summoned, instead of burying the corpse, had it preserved, and it is still in existence today. Baker broke off relations with Stanton, who was discharged from the Army and as head of the Secret Service in 1866. In 1867, in his book, The History of the U.S. Secret Service, he admitted delivering Booth's diary to Stanton, and on another occasion, testified that the diary was intact when it was in his possession. This means that Stanton did remove the pages to facilitate a cover-up, because the pages were found in his collection. Andrew Johnson, who became president, issued the Amnesty Proclamation on May 29, 1865, to reunite the country. It stipulated that the South would not be responsible for the debt incurred, that all secession laws were to end, and that slavery was to be abolished. Needless to say, the Rothschild, who heavily funded the South, lost a lot of money. In addition, the cost of the support of the Russian fleet cost the country about $7.2 million. Johnson didn't have the constitutional authority to give money to a foreign government, so arrangements were made to purchase Alaska from the Russians in April 1867. It was labeled as Seward's Folly because it appeared that Seward purchased what was then a worthless piece of land, when in fact it was compensation for the Russian Navy. In August 1867, Johnson failed in an attempt to remove Stanton from office, and impeachment proceedings were begun against him in February 1868 by Stanton and the Radical Republicans. Johnson was charged with attempting to fire Stanton without Senate approval, for treason against Congress, and public language indecent and unbecoming as the nation's leader. Senator Benjamin F. Wade, President pro tempore of the Senate, next in the line of presidential succession, was so sure that Johnson would be impeached, that he already had his cabinet picked. Stanton was to be his Secretary of Treasury. The May 26 vote was 35-19, one short of the necessary two-thirds needed to impeach Johnson. Colonel Lafayette Baker, who threatened to reveal the conspiracy, was slowly poisoned till he died in 1868. President James A. Garfield, our 20th president, also realized the danger posed by the bankers and said, "Whoever controls the money of a nation, controls that nation." He was assassinated in 1881, during the first year of his presidency. In 1877, in Lampasas County, Texas, a group of farmers formed a group called the Knights of Reliance, who were concerned about the financial power being concentrated into the hands of a few. Later renamed the Farmers Alliance, it spread to 120 chapters throughout Texas, and by 1887, the movement stretched up to the Dakotas, and as far east as the Carolinas. By the time 1890 rolled around, this populist philosophy had succeeded in establishing itself, and they had elected governors and congressmen.